What do the Rings of Power actually do? This is a question that is asked a lot these days for no specific reason, and also a lot of confusion is around this. And in this video I want to give you a short overview of the abilities, looking into the books and some quotes here and there. My name is Chris, aka The Philosopher's Games, and of course, as always, I try to pronounce names as Tolkien described it, but let us start. First of all, there are two categories of the Rings of Power. First, we have the famous Great Rings of Power. This would include the 1 ring, the 9 rings, the 7 and the 3. And then we also have an unspecified number of lesser rings of power. The lesser rings were created in the process of learning the craft from Anatar/Sauron to make rings of power. And when the elves in Eregion, under their leader Celebrimbor, perfected their craft, they created the first 16 great rings of power, the 7 and the 9. And then, when Anatar/Sauron left Eregion to also start making the 1 ring in secret in the fires of Mount Doom in Mordor, then Celebrimbor alone made his magnum opus with a little design change, and these were then the 3 rings of power, Vilya, Nenya and Narya. As a result of Anatar not being there, he did not know about these 3 rings, and Celebrimbor made those, as Tolkien writes, in secret. Only when Sauron created the 1 ring and put the rings on his finger, then I think he knew that there were 3 more rings he did not expect. Also, Sauron did not touch these 3 rings, which is different for all the other rings, and due to this, even though they are still based on Sauron's evil design, the elves can actually do something good with those rings, and they don't have an as evil tendency as the other rings of power in comparison. Still, they are also subject to the 1 ring. And this is also one of the main abilities of those rings. They have kind of a backdoor in them. So if Sauron now creates a ring that is so much more powerful by putting a lot of his will and own power into it, then he is able to control all the others who wear a ring. He can read their thoughts and he can even dominate them because he is such a powerful being, and due to his strong will and his nature of being so powerful, he is able to control all the others, and this was his plan. He wanted to use the 1 ring to control the elves. Quote, "And while he, Sauron, wore the 1 ring, he could perceive all the things that were done by the means of the lesser rings, and he could see and govern the very thoughts of those that wore them." Lesser rings here means rings lesser than the 1 ring. In this context and in their origin, all 19 rings created by the elves in Eregion were elven rings. You could make an argument that this was maybe different for 1 ring because the dwarves of the house of Durin believed that their ring was given to them by the smiths of Eregion directly. In the end, maybe due to his own arrogance, Sauron underestimated the elves. When he created the 1 ring, the elves knew who he truly was, and that keeping the rings of power would have severe consequences for them. So they took the rings off their fingers, and Sauron's plan failed. Of course, while Sauron was in Eregion in disguise, he did not tell the elves about this secret ability of those rings. But there are also other abilities that these rings possess. In letter 131, Tolkien writes that the chief power of all the rings alike was the prevention or slowing of decay. This was very important for the elves because their immortal nature clashed with the decay of Middle-earth. And that is the reason why they have to sail to the west at one point, because there, this effect, this decay of the world, is not as strong. The elves, though, did not want to leave Middle-earth yet, and these rings would help them to stay longer, potentially even indefinitely in Middle-earth. The 3 rings of power are especially good at this. Another important power of these rings is that they are able to enhance the natural abilities of those who wear them. About the 9 rings we can, for example, read, Those who used the 9 rings became mighty in their day, kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. There might also maybe some ring-specific abilities for the 3 rings. It's not 100% clear if all have them or if this one quote we have is specific to Narya, because when Gandalf received his ring, Círdan, who had the ring before, said to him, "For this is a ring of fire, and with it you may rekindle hearts in a world that grows chill." If Nenya and Vilya had the same ability or also own specific abilities, that is not clear. We only know that Vilya is the mightiest of the 3, though interestingly, in early iterations when Tolkien wrote The Lord of the Rings, Nenya was the most powerful. Further, there's another interesting detail about the 3 rings. Quote, "He knows that it is not one of the 3, for they have never been lost and they endure no evil." So it also seems that the 3 rings of power don't endure evil. And I think it shows because the elves could actually do good things with those 3 rings. In case of the dwarves and their 7 rings, we also know that the foundation of each of the 7 hordes of the dwarves was a golden ring, as we can read in the Silmarillion. And in The Lord of the Rings, we can also read that it needs gold to breed gold. So in this case, the Ring of Durin, but I think it can also be applied to the other rings. I think another interesting ability that the Rings of Power had, except for the 3, and I think it would also include the lesser Rings of Power, that they could make you invisible. What that means is a bit difficult to explain, but Tolkien's world basically has 2 aspects. The seen world, so the physical world, and the unseen world, which is basically the aspect of the world where the spirits live. So that means the invisibility is caused by being moved to the unseen aspect of the world. And this the wearer could control. They, the 9 men who got the Rings of Power, could walk if they would unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron. And further, Tolkien writes about this ability, and finally they had other powers, more directly derived from Sauron, such as rendering invisible the material body and making things of the invisible world visible. So here Tolkien explains that this ability comes from Sauron. And in context of the last quote, it makes sense because because he was a necromancer, he had power over the unseen world, he could send his phantoms and delusions to those who would wear those rings. Also, in the same text, Tolkien writes about the 3 rings of power. They did not confer invisibility. So this was definitely different for the 3. And the last ability, which was in my opinion a side effect that was, according to Lord of the Rings, exclusive to the Great Rings, quote, "He knows that it is a great ring, for it gave long life." So that is the ability of prolonging the life of the wearer. And I think that's just a side effect, because in their origin, as mentioned, all these elves were elven rings, and elves don't need this effect. But due to maybe their ability to preserve, this might have an effect on a mortal wearer that just makes his body not age that much anymore. Interesting, Tolkien writes about the dwarves in this context. Though they could be slain or broken, they could not be reduced to shadows, enslaved to another will, and for the same reason their lives were not affected by any ring to live either longer or shorter because of it. And here we come to a section which I would call negative side effects of the rings. If a mortal being wears a ring of power and uses it frequently to become invisible, at some point that being will fade. And as Gandalf says, he becomes in the end invisible permanently and walks in the twilight under the eye of the dark power that rules the rings. And this is exactly what happened to those 9 men who became the Nazgul. Further, they had, as it seemed, unending life, yet life became unendurable to them. And of course, they were, while wearing these rings, and Sauron had the One Ring, under his control anyway, so they basically had not a chance. Interestingly, this is completely different for the dwarves. The only power over them that the rings wielded was to inflame their hearts with a greed of gold and precious things, so that if they lacked them, all other good things seemed profitless, and they were filled with wrath and desire for vengeance on all who deprived them. But they were made from their beginning of a kind to resist most steadfastly any domination. Though they could be slain or broken, they could not be reduced to shadows, enslaved to another will, and for the same reason their lives were not affected by any ring to live either longer or shorter because of it. A section of this quote we already had previously. But it seems potentially also the 3 rings of power had a negative side effect. It was at that time that she, Galadriel, received Nenya, the white ring from Celebrimbor, and by its power the realm of Lorinand was strengthened and made beautiful. But its power upon her was great also and unforeseen, for it increased her latent desire for the sea and for return into the west, so that her joy in Middle-earth was diminished. So even the 3 had a negative side effect, and this shows definitely that all of them had a negative tendency, because the original design was that of Sauron, and that was created with an evil intent. Even though the 3 rings could be used for good and were not touched by Sauron, they still, as Elrond says, should have been destroyed. Then there is also a weird quote in Lord of the Rings, which is something that Gandalf says. A ring of power looks after itself, Frodo. It may slip off treacherously, but its keeper never abandons it. At most, he plays with the idea of handing it to someone else's care, and that only at an early stage when it first begins to grip. I think what Gandalf means here is not a great ring of power in general, but the One Ring. Because we have a lot of cases where wearers of a great ring of power just freely give their ring to the next generation. For example, Círdan had his ring for thousands of years, and he gives it freely to Gandalf when he arrives in the Third Age. Also, we know that the kings of Khazad-dûm gave their ring to the next generation. For example, Thror gave his ring to his son Throin freely and then left for a little adventure. Then also we had the case where, for example, even Sauron took the 9 rings of his Nazgul to make himself more powerful and make up for the loss of the One Ring. Further, there is no documented case of a great ring of power, except for the One Ring, of course, to slip off the finger of its wearer. That would also contradict their design, because in their origin, the idea was that the elves of Eregion would wear those rings and then Sauron could control them. So it makes no sense that they would slip off their fingers. This quote clearly just means a One Ring. As a result, I would also say that the rings of power, except for the one, had not their own will. And I think outside of some very specific questions like would elves become invisible if they used one of those great rings of power that had this ability, that's a complicated topic, maybe for a different video, but I hope this gives you a decent overview of what the rings of power actually do. Of course, there's also the One Ring, which is just the most powerful version, and the Master Ring to control all the others. This ring also had the ability to, for example, change its size. And of course, it has a will of its own, because it is part of Sauron's being. A bit of Sauron is in this ring. Thank you for watching. I hope you liked this video. If so, maybe press the like button, subscribe, and leave a comment. Maybe you have some questions regarding the Rings of Power, or some comments here on this video, maybe some additions that I forgot, which is quite possible. It's a complicated topic with lots of little quotes spread through all kinds of books, but I hope this was a decent overview. And if you're looking for more lore videos, maybe check out this channel. There are some playlists and so on. I'm also currently covering a show with a kind of similar name. If you're interested in this, feel free to join. And I would say, again, Thank you for watching and see you people next time. Goodbye.